Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hurrah. Oh, that gave me a heart attack. The weather up here where we are is very rural, and sadly, that means that it affects our internet, which is not ideal when we're doing these sorts of things. So, welcome. We'll just see who's here. Hello, Maria. Hi. There's a few others I know that are coming through. We'll just see who else comes through and comes in. But welcome. Tonight is all about rescue dogs. Understanding rescue dogs, working with rescue dogs. We can hear there's one next door barking. You know, we've got plenty of rescue dogs here. So the goal is, thank you, that'll do, good boy, is to talk through rescue dogs and where I got involved. Hi, Steph, welcome. So just first things first, for those of you that haven't met me before, hi, Joe. I'm Estelle Lation from All Sorts Dog Training. I've been in New Zealand for the last about 13 years now, but originally I was in the UK working with dogs, and you know, I've been working here with dogs for the last nearly about 8 years. So essentially my role in the UK was working at Battersea Dogs Home. That's Dogs and Cats Home actually now. And working with a whole range of dogs with a variety of behaviours, breed types, you name it, we had to deal with it. So that led me onto a path of working with canine behaviour, and also how we could bring out the best in these rescue dogs to get them placed into new homes, but also what they could do potentially as work as well. I placed a lot of them as working dogs into working roles with the armed forces and biosecurity. So I learned a huge amount in that situation. I would say I was thrown in the deep end. And for anyone who's wanting to learn about canine behaviour or become perhaps a trainer of any sort, I would say it's fantastic qualifications, but you need to back that up by working with a range of dogs. Mainly because most people that we are working with are people who may have adopted a rescue dog. And it's important that you can help those people and understand what they're going through. I think until you've actually had rescue dogs yourself, it's actually pretty tricky for you as a trainer or a behaviourist to advise, I think, sufficiently on those dogs and what you can do and what you can't do until you've actually experienced some of those things yourself. So I've had the pleasure of working with some of the most difficult dogs throughout my life, but they have been a window to learning and understanding, you know, what rescue dogs are about and how to bring out the best in them. We ourselves are regular fosterers of dogs. We work with a lot of the rescues here in New Zealand, with the vets as well. And I think we're at over 50 dogs now that we've fostered and placed elsewhere. We currently have 9 dogs in the house at the moment. And a large majority of those are foster dogs or dogs that we are working on with their behaviour before we can place them into new homes. So I guess the biggest question for a lot of people with rescue dogs is whether you should adopt one or not. There's a lot of debate about whether you should go and get a puppy from a breeder or whether you should rescue. There's quite a few things you need to consider. There's Cora just over there having a drink, if you can hear her. She's wandering around. I do have, by the way, another dog here. Rusty? Hey, who's that? Yeah, who's there? So there are a few dogs in the room. So if you hear a few noises, that's because they're present in the room as well. Rusty here was a rescue to some degree. I call him a rehome, really, from over in Taranui. He was getting into trouble for chasing lots of things he shouldn't be chasing. But he now lives in our household, and we've got him, you know, used to all the animals here and the cats as well. Cora's just here. Hi, Cora. Hey, sweetie. Who's been with us for a fair while now, who's got partial deafness. So it's kind of quite hard to place her because not everybody wants to work with a deaf dog, but she's an absolute sweet soul. She really is. So in reality, yeah, adopting dogs you've really got to think about, there's quite a few things I say to people that you really need to consider, which is, first off, what is your knowledge? If you're a first-time dog owner, is having a rescue dog really going to be the best thing for you and for them? Sometimes we have this desire to want to help dogs, but in reality, if you're not knowledgeable enough, you can find that you get into this trap where you've got a dog with these behavioural problems and you're having to learn on the job, so to speak. Now, don't get me wrong, plenty of people can do that, but it is a tougher route for all of you. So you must always consider whether you know enough about canine behaviour, canine body language, and perhaps the potential things that might crop up with a rescue dog. Your experience with dogs. I meet loads of people that have had plenty of dogs, but they've all been dogs perhaps from very good homes, from puppies, and then they get themselves a rescue dog with behavioural issues, and then they can't understand why whatever they've done before isn't working now. It's also important to consider your lifestyle. Has your lifestyle appropriate to help these particular dogs? A lot of the dogs that come out of rescue, come with, behaviors that are going to need, some help. And if you're busy or you work full time, have you really got the ability there to help them work through some of those issues, some of the particular issues you can't if you work full time? You've also got to consider things like the age. The majority of dogs that end up in rescue are adolescent dogs. And that's because generally the puppies do find homes more quickly. And then the novelty of that pup sometimes wears off. And as those dogs enter adolescence, we say that their brains are under reconstruction. And a lot of people struggle to work with teenage dogs and find that they fall into this trap again with things escalating, behaviors escalating, and they can't seem to get out of it. So a lot of dogs get given up or rehomed in that age group. So I always advise people, and I say, well, be aware that for many of the dogs that come into rescue, you are going to be taking on a teenage dog and what comes with that as well. So it's important to consider all of these things. Similarly, we have got to look at the breed types of dogs that come into rescue. Now, nowadays, actually, you can get all different types of dogs in rescue. It's not your standard pitties and staffies. I've seen Labradoodles and all sorts of things, Spaniels. But essentially, we've got to understand, what's brought them to that point to be rehomed. Is there a genuine reason behind that? Is it that, the people's situation has changed and purely it's nothing the dog's done, it's just the circumstances have changed, the people are going abroad, those sorts of things? Or is it because there are some behaviours there that the people couldn't deal with or didn't know how to, solve, or perhaps it wasn't safe in their household, and that's why they are parting ways with their dog? So it's really important when taking on rescues to really ask lots of questions, particularly if they're coming from another home. Now, if you're going to take something out of the pound or the rescues charities, there's not always that history there. There's not always that knowledge of what's happened, but we can make assumptions about, what may have happened to them or where they may have come from, and that can contribute to understanding how their behaviour may evolve. Certainly in this country, something I've had to get used to is the number of hunting breeds that are here in this country. And of course, they are genetically very engineered towards, hunting down pigs here, as well as deer and all sorts of other things. And those are the sorts of behaviours where they're hardwired genetics in their breeding, and somebody's bringing them into an environment perhaps where they suddenly start experience chase behaviours with this dog, or chasing livestock or their cats. So we got to always think about, what really to be aware of when you're taking these dogs on. There's no doubt that taking these dogs on can be some of the most rewarding things that you can do, and actually it can teach you a huge amount. So you've really got to just be wise about what you're picking that suits your situation, not just because you fall in love with the dog and get it impulsively. This is a long-term commitment, but really thinking about what you need to do to make sure you're setting it up right. The key here really is, are you committed to working with this dog every day? That's not just loving it and walking it. That is actually educating these dogs, because a lot of these dogs are adolescent and they've lacked that education. And it's our job for taking them that we give them that education that they need to be well-mannered dogs in our society. So this brings me to really the nature versus nurture. It's important that, you know, genetics play a part, but really ultimately we can also look at, you know, the effects of, you know, their experiences of life, their learned behaviours. So when we work with these sorts of dogs, it's critical that we, you know, think about what socializing they've had. And if they come from environments perhaps that aren't quite so, you know, loving or with very gentle exposure and have had more harsh exposure, those dogs may not have been exposed to much at all. Or they may have come from a rural environment and now you're bringing them into town. So we need to consider how all these things really affect these dogs. We also similarly need to understand, you know, what socializing means. There's a classic mistake, which is people think that socializing a dog is suddenly putting them in scenarios to get them, you know, friendly with everything. And that might be putting them in a large scale daycare, or, you know, taking them to the market. But for many of these dogs, that can overwhelm them. And the very thing that you're trying to make them better with can actually unravel later on and create more behavioral problems further down the road. And we see a lot of these rescue dogs in situations where they're not well equipped or they're not confident enough to handle or combat the myriad of things that they're faced with in our human world on a daily basis. So often I say to people with rescue dogs, it's gentle socializing. It's very gradual introductions, you know, a couple of people and then add in maybe another one, or, you know, a dog here, a dog there, then bring in more once they're comfortable with those. It's that gentle, gradual progression and exposure which actually builds their confidence and their sociability. Flooding them, as we call it, can actually be detrimental to their overall sociability and is more likely at times to create a dog that resorts to tactics of aggression to stop those things happening, those things that they're worried about or frightened about. So we must always take that into account. So sociability is a spectrum, don't get me wrong, in personality of dogs. We have introverted and extroverted dogs, and they look at the world very differently, just like people. And those dogs with their personalities will sit somewhere within that range. We also need to take into account age. Sociability in dogs can often change as they get older. So the older they get, the less sociable they become. That often surprises people. And I say, well, that's no different to us. We're exactly the same. As I get older, I get less sociable. You know, the people that I used to hang with when I was younger, I probably don't hang with so much today. The people that I'm not so comfortable with, perhaps don't enjoy their company. You know, I tend to sort of not be around them so much anymore. So it's important we understand that as well when we're relating to these dogs, because we can't presume that your rescue dog will necessarily be a young adult. It might be older too. And they have a lot more learned experience and life experiences behind them from wherever they've come from before. So when we bring a rescue dog into our home, some of you may or may not have heard of the rule of three. The rule of three is essentially a bit of a guide to help you understand the timeline for these dogs, that you'll start to see changes with them and what your expectation should be within those time frames. So the rule of three relates to a time. So the first is giving the dog 3 days to decompress. Now, what do we mean by decompress? Decompress is essentially the ability to allow the dog to rest. A lot of these dogs, particularly ones that come out of the pound, have had very stressful environment with lots of noise and anxiety in those kennels and sometimes barking. And they're exhausted. They probably haven't slept for long periods of time. They may have come from a home where it was stressful too, so they haven't slept well there either. So generally with a lot of rescue dogs, we advise people to do very little with their dogs in the first 3 days. We want them to just feel comfortable in the home as quick as possible and feel safe. Introducing that rescue dog to all your friends and all your mates and all the dogs that you might want them to know in future in those first 3 days can be catastrophically a bad idea. It can set them up to fail, and it can lead to sometimes a breakdown in the relationship between you and that dog very quickly if you see behaviors in that dog that you don't like. And it may not be the fault of the dog. It may be the dog is just not feeling safe at that time and therefore reacts in a way that it feels is appropriate at that moment to defend itself. So it's super important those first 3 days. Whenever I take a foster dog into my care, I have a set pattern of what I do with those first 3 days, which is I introduce the dogs into their bed area. Normally it's a crate. I get them used to going in and out of the crate, so willingly, without too much force. And I want them to feel like nothing's going to bother them when they're in there. They're going to get fed, they can have rest in there, and then I will take them out on lead into our area to go to the toilet. And so I show them where all the amenities are. But I don't really ask much of the dog in that time. I don't, test their obedience or see what they know. That's not really the purpose. I just want them to know that I'm there to assist them, but I'm not there to pressure them. And I want them to have 3 days of just observing. Really that's what we're talking about, is time to rest and time to observe. Once those 3 days are out the way, and depending on how the dog's doing, I may extend that decompression time depending on the dog. With very nervous dogs, sometimes I'll push that out to 7 to 10 days, even 2 weeks, depending on the dog. But once we get the dog feeling more comfortable, is happy to follow with me around, then we go into the 3-week process. So that is by 3 weeks, the dogs are generally starting to learn what your routines are. It can be very unnerving for dogs and for people, I think, too, if you don't know what to expect. It's quite challenging for them to not know what's going to happen, and that can frighten them. So the more routines you are in those first 3 weeks, the better for the dog to pick up on that routine and to understand that you are predictable. It's funny because I speak with a lot of people and their interpretation of some dogs is that they're unpredictable, when actually when I assess the situation, I can see it's the people being unpredictable and less so the dog. So predictability in those first 3 weeks is really important. So that means having a really good routine so the dog knows what to expect, when feed times are, all those sorts of things, walks, exercise, all those sorts of things. And just so that they still know where they can return to if they're, not feeling safe. Remember, there's going to be lots of sounds in those first 3 weeks that are not going to be familiar for them. So again, actually, in those first 3 weeks, I limit their exposure to people coming to the home. It's still a very raw period of time, and I don't want the dog to feel inadvertently worried by something just in my haste to introduce them to other people. Genuinely, less is more in this time. Give them more time to just get familiar with all of you guys and build a trust bank and a relationship with you before bringing anyone else in. It's very hard for them to trust anybody else if the core family aren't quite there yet with them too. We also find that after 3 weeks, the dogs are starting to learn out what are your rules. The rules in their last home might be very different to the rules in your home. You might be no dogs on furniture. The last home didn't have a problem with dogs on furniture, so the dog jumps on the sofa, you scold them. That's stressful for them because they don't understand that that's not appropriate. So we've got to consider all of these things. It takes quite a bit of time for the dogs to work out what they can and can't do in your presence. Similarly, if you've got another dog, they're learning all this with the other dog in your home too, and building a relationship with them. Generally, we find with rescue dogs, though, it's really around the 3-month mark where we start to see the behaviours of the dog start to change, for the better or for the worse. It depends on the dog. By this stage, after 3 months, the dogs are starting to feel more settled, and they may start to show more signs of their learnt history or their personality, so to speak. This is often where people get caught off guard because the dog that they knew for the first 3 months is now starting to change into something else. And that's really born out of perhaps confidence or perhaps the experiences they've had so far. So often after 3 months, we start to see some more behaviours developing that for a lot of people, they may not be very happy about. And that can include a variety of behaviours, including things like barking at strangers or sounds or other dogs, or perhaps showing signs of being stressed about being left alone. Things like, being frustrated on the lead or reacting on the lead. These sorts of things can all sorts of start to crop up after 3 months of age. Some dogs, it's earlier. They demonstrate these behaviours a lot earlier. So we've got to be very careful that we don't fall into this cycle of loving the dog's story. It's amazing how many people I go visit on a behaviour consultation, and they often desperately want to tell me about the story of their dog, where it came from, how it was emaciated, how it happened with this. Now, these things are important in the physiology of your dog and how that's affected your dog, and potentially for life. But sometimes it's to the detriment of these dogs that we hang on to that story for too long, and we can use it as an excuse for actually some of the behaviours that we're seeing with these dogs, when in fact, if we are consistent in our handling and training with these dogs, some of these behaviours would actually resolve or perhaps be extinguished and we wouldn't see them again. So it's important that we don't get too hung up on that story and keep the dog in its past, and we assist them in moving forward and building confidence to move forward into their new life. So really, where do we start with these dogs? Well, for me, the golden rule with these dogs is really about safety. Most of the problems with rescue dogs that I see, or the behaviours that they start to display, are purely as a result of the dog not feeling safe. If they don't feel safe in their relationships with you, or secure in their relationships with you or in their environment, then behaviours are likely to develop. So we need to build in sort of safety systems and management systems to prevent the rehearsal of some unwanted behaviours. So that can be anything like, dog crates, pens, baby gates, kennels, if it's appropriate for the dog and your environment. And just ensuring that there's a set pattern with those as to how you may introduce the dog to somebody and what you do. Probably second to that, I get into playing with a dog. Something I do is always play with these rescue dogs at least once a day, ideally twice a day. Play is a bonding mechanism. It's a chance to really develop your relationship with these dogs, quickly. And if you can get a dog to play with you, that means they're really starting to feel comfortable in your presence and letting their guard down. Now, you can choose whether that's with you or it could be with another dog. But if you want the dog to want to, do with things with you and work with you, then it makes sense for you to play with a dog more than perhaps your other dog if you've got another dog playing with that new rescue dog. Just as a rule of thumb on that, my advice to people is if your dog plays with another dog every day, if, say, for example, they've played with that other dog for an hour, you need to replicate that and then add some, so really 2 hours of play with you to counteract that enjoyment they have with that dog and to build the more influence back onto you again. Otherwise, they start to become more fixated on other dogs, and then you can struggle to get that relationship back again. So just something to bear in mind. So going back to the safety thing, I always build a very, very reliable on your bed cue. And that's really for a few reasons, which is if we're going to work with rescue dogs who perhaps are worried by people or perhaps overzealous behavior, then an on your bed cue is the one that I really advise people to work on as much as possible. I want the dog to know where it can go to settle, where it can go to lie down, where it can go to get rewarded. And the simplest way to do that is that every dinner time, I feed my dogs twice a day. Every dinner time, they know where to go to be fed. I started the process by guiding them to the crate and then putting their food in there, but now they run there in advance. Some of them, I'm prepping the food and they're already sitting in their crates ready and waiting. It just builds a really good pattern of behavior and a high rate of reinforcement on that particular act, because when you might really need it, perhaps when there's something that's worrying them outside, or you've got a visitor coming, it's very easy to pop the dog away initially to lower their level of excitement, or perhaps their arousal or their worry, before maybe you do an introduction. So an on your bed cue is super, super important. And that's probably a real foundation for a whole follow-on of behaviors off that point. If you don't do it with a dinner, my advice is do at least 20 repetitions of that a day, getting the dog to go onto the bed 20 times a day. And I would do that for at least that first 3 months, if I could as well. From there, I will start building a bit of separation with these rescue dogs. A lot of them have attachment issues. And so it's super important that once they build a bond, or once they trust you, then they feel like they need to be with you all the time. The problem with that is it can then create separation worry or separation issues. So what's really important is to build some separation from you whilst you're home, not whilst you go out, whilst you're home. The common mistake people have with rescue dogs is they want to spend all their time with them when they're home, but that builds a relationship sometimes with these dogs where the dog cannot cope without reaching you, even if you're in the home. So it's super important that the dogs spend periods of time separated from you, whether again you use crates, baby gates, whatever you want to do, where they can't access you or follow you around a little bit, and you build that up very small amounts, throughout a few weeks. And that prepares the dogs for a little bit of separation, perhaps when you go out shopping or perhaps you go to work. If you work full time, then that's a little bit more tricky to do, because the dog is in a state of flux of suddenly there's nobody around and then suddenly everybody's back again. And that can be really quite tough on these dogs. So sometimes having the assistance of perhaps an adventure dog walker in those scenarios, who takes them out into environments that are generally not too busy populated areas, but more fun and adventure orientated towards the dog's needs, will work for you guys in that scenario. I would also recommend teaching your dog initially 5 different movements. Now you can choose what those are, and it's because if we practice those 5 different movements and we reinforce them over and over and over again, and when I say reinforce, that means we reward those behaviors multiple times, then those can be behaviors that can be very useful to you in future, particularly if you're struggling perhaps with the dog being worried about something or being over aroused by something. So it doesn't have to be your standard sits and downs, although I would recommend they are very good to do. You could do something more fun, like twists or turns, or getting the dog to move around your body. Any of these sorts of things which can keep their brain engaged can actually be a really good system to helping them around perhaps some stresses or triggers that are out there. So again, my recommendation for a lot of rescue dogs is to teach 5 solid behaviors. And that really means you need to reinforce those with some form of reward. Whether you use toys or food depends on the dog, but you need to make sure that every time you ask the dog to do something or show them how to do it, you back that up with some form of reward. I don't know about you guys, I don't generally work for free, although I'm very kindly doing this for free for you guys. But dogs do need to be paid for their efforts. There's got to be something in it for them. And science-based evidence shows that dogs perform behaviors better long term if they have been reliably rewarded every time they've done something. So it's just something to note. Classic one there, I'll give you an example, is most things that people teach their dogs when I ask them is to sit and wait for their dinner. And then in the end, the dog doesn't have to even be told to sit, because it understands the level of reward that's coming. It's worth sitting because there's my whole bowl of dinner. So instead of perhaps making your dog sit and wait for their dinner, ask them to do something else instead before you present their dinner. It could be spin, turn, whatever. It just makes you reliable in doing that because you're going to consistently do it every day. Yes, you could do multiple repetitions throughout the day in short sessions, but I guarantee that you're more likely to succeed and do those things at dinner times for your dogs. And the dog will see the value of the reward in that and be more likely to offer the behavior. So Common behavioural issues with rescue dogs. What are we likely to see or crop up with these particular types of dogs? There's loads of people out there who've got rescue dogs, and for a lot of them, they're very lucky that they don't generally have too many issues. I'm not saying that all rescue dogs have problems. That's simply not the case. And it sometimes is just that some dogs have a predisposition to things, or perhaps their placement and where they've gone to is so catastrophically different to what they're used to that they perhaps don't have the capability to cope in those sorts of environments. But if we do get dogs that start demonstrating some behavior issues, then we need to look at some systems as to how we can help them with those particular problems. Things like fears of sounds. I think that's probably one of the top things I see with rescue dogs. And why is that? Why do we get so many of these rescue dogs terrified of sudden, loud bangs? Well, for a lot of these rescue dogs, they've missed what I call that critical socializing period. Many of them, in the way that they have been raised, have not been raised in a responsible way, quite simply. They may have been left to their own devices. They may have been born outside under a shed, who knows? But many of them have had no or little input from people in a domestic setting to prepare them for life in a domestic setting. The critical window for socializing on these sorts of things is really up to around about 12 weeks of age. Some dogs it's a little bit earlier than that. Some dogs it's a little bit later than that, depending on the size. But in that period, there's a window for them to learn about what's a threat and what's not, and what is the norm and what can be, ignored essentially, particularly between the 5 to 6 week period. So that's when more dogs are likely to learn about something that might be frightening or threatening to them, particularly if the mother is present. It's in that period, that fear period, they'll learn these things, and then it will perpetuate within the system and then come out later on as adolescents. So for many people, they adopt these puppies when they're, around about 8 weeks, potentially some of them older. And then, of course, a lot of people will adopt a rescue dog that's, maybe an adolescent. So that's something over 5 to 6 months of age. By then, that critical socializing period has already finished. So now we are dealing with bolstering essentially whatever they learned in that early period. Now, if they didn't learn enough about gentle exposure to these things and positive exposure to these things, the starting point is always a little bit more tricky. And because they are adolescents, they are much more aware now of those threats. They can comprehend more what is a threat, and they're more likely to vocalize about something that's a worry to them. So sounds is a classic one we see. Sometimes that can be associated with a visual. Here in the Bay of Plenty, last year, I had multiple cases of dogs that were affected by kite surfers. Not only the visual of them in the sky, but the landing of them on the sand and the banging sound of them on the sand, with several dogs bolting back to their homes or across roads because they were so frightened of the sound and the sight of them. And that can live with the dog. That trauma event can live with the dog for many months, even years. And it can set a cycle of these dogs being particularly worried by these loud sounds. Now, why is one dog okay and why not, even if they haven't had that critical socializing? Well, essentially, it can boil down to the breed side of things. Again, dogs that have been selectively bred to hunt or to work are very finely tuned in that selective breeding. They've got to be able to hear, small animal sounds or somebody calling from a very long distance. So they are much more sensitive to these particular sounds. Indeed, there are studies that show that sometimes these loud sounds can indeed be painful to these dogs. So you can understand why the association may be so negative for them. Again, this comes back to making sure there are safety mechanisms for these dogs and planning in advance if there are some of these loud sounds. We can do some sound desensitization, and we can work with vets to make sure that the dogs are not going to be overly stressed during periods like we've just had for fireworks. Second is fear of strangers or visitors. I'd say it's probably one of the highest ones on my list is dogs barking at people or unfamiliar people. Now, this kind of falls into two camps. There is the territorial barkers. That's the ones that once they get established in the home, they tend to start barking at passers-by or people coming to the house. And then we have other dogs who are perhaps more intimidated by people out and about. And that could not just, people that they know, it's more people that they don't know. And particularly it seems to be singular people. Don't forget, if there's a lot of people, a dog has often enough common sense not to tackle a whole group of people. It would not be in their interests. If they try to tackle a whole bunch of people, they really are putting themselves on the back foot. But a singular person is an easier target for them to tackle. So we often see more displays of behaviour towards these types of people. A lot of people spend a huge amount of time analysing why this person, why not that person, were they wearing a hat, were they wearing glasses? Well, yes, these things definitely can contribute to how a dog deems as something safe or not. Again, that early socializing period starts to form a picture in their mind as to what's safe and what's not. And if the picture in their mind is not somebody with a beard and that they've ever seen before, then the dogs will start to discriminate against those type of people. The outline of that person is different, so they are not to be trusted. So it's important, again, that we set up safety systems for those dogs at home so they can't rehearse these behaviours, and out and about we ensure that the dogs have a reliable recall and have systems in place to feel safe, and that you will take control of the situation and give them options to move away from anything that they are frightened of. We also then have fear of other dogs. Now, this is a very broad one. There are many dogs that display reactivity from rescues towards other dogs. For some, it comes back to a lack of socializing, and perhaps they haven't seen certain types of dogs. Again, there's that discrimination. If they've never seen small dogs or big dogs, they might be frightened of what they are and don't have any history of interacting with them in a positive way. It doesn't always mean that something bad's happened, it's just a lack of exposure. On the other side of this, we can have dogs that have had events already. We see this particularly with dogs that are roaming dogs. So they may have come into the pound, but they've been roaming the streets. Many street dogs often do get into fights. They're normally uncastrated males, and they may be competing over a female that also is roaming around the streets. So sometimes some of these dogs, know what to do around other dogs and can spur on a fight if there's, a really important goal for them at the end. So some dogs like this, again, we have to decide whether they're going to be appropriate to go into a home, and castration certainly can help, but it doesn't always cure all. But by far the majority of reactivity towards other dogs is based out of fear. More dogs that I see are more frightened of other dogs and the intentions of other dogs and dogs rushing at them than anything else. And that contributes hugely to how they feel about those dogs. Again, when they're young, they tend to show flight responses, but as they enter adolescence, they find methods to, essentially show fight behaviors, and that's going forwards to remove the threat because that seems more appropriate and effective. Again, it all depends on who's in the end of the lead and who's contributing to those behaviors and your knowledge and experience to handle those situations, not make it worse. We also deal with separation worry. We mentioned it before. For many of these dogs, they have abandonment issues, and that can really lead to a lot of dogs with worry, particularly when they build a relationship with you. They fear that, you might disappear. Remember, a lot of these dogs have no clue where you're going. When you disappear, they don't know where you've gone. They don't know that you've gone to work. And they don't know when you're going to come back. So this is why it's super important that we prep them for that. Certainly, there are a lot of dogs that I fostered with huge separation worry issues that have been handed around to different homes, maybe 3 or 4. And that has no doubt contributed to some of the separation worry. Again, that's one of those things where there's a few categories within the separation worry, and what we do might vary according to that category. So you really need to get behaviorists to identify what it is so they can tell you, how you should work with it. But one thing I would advise you is if your dog is demonstrating separation worry, it can be very tricky to deal with if you are out at work all day. And then we get other behaviors like chasing. And that can be chasing things like livestock, birds, running away. again, a lot of these rescue dogs may have had the freedom to already hunt and kill things prior to coming to your home. Particularly the dogs here in New Zealand that are selectively bred as pig dogs, many of them have already experienced some of those behaviours. So it often surprises people when their dog starts chasing things. And this is an instinctual behaviour that will start to gear up, particularly after 6 months of age. There's also evidence to show that dogs that suffer with some level of anxiety or worry often demonstrate more prey drive behaviours too, but that's still in early research too. But it is important to see that some of these rescue dogs are more likely to have some of those chase behaviours because they may have experienced it already or are predisposed to doing so. So it's something just to be aware of. So following on from that, then, of course, we do have things like a veterinary assessment. With rescue dogs, the first thing I'll always look at whenever we're assessing a dog is, are there any medical issues with these dogs? Remember, a lot of rescues haven't been raised on a good diet, and that can contribute to a lot of things later on. Particularly if they're young dogs and they're growing and they've not had a good diet, we can see the knock-on effects, further down the line. The myth that, a rescue dog or a crossbreed isn't going to have medical issues, I just don't agree with anymore. There's still a high chance that even with a crossbreed or a rescue that you could have some medical issues. Yes, okay, so we're not fully aware that what they may be, like some of the breeds, the pedigree breeds, but essentially we can say that some of these dogs may have issues further down the line because they had a poor diet at the beginning. They may struggle to go onto a kibble diet because that's not something they've had. They've grown up with bones and raw bones and scavenging. So we need to look at all of these things. We also need to assess them for pain. Pain is a huge contributor to aggressive behaviours sometimes. And often in a lot of cases I'll watch, I can see that the dog is demonstrating some potential lameness or discomfort somewhere, and that would require further investigation before we move forward with a behaviour modification program. Any trainer or behaviourist worth their salt will always try and get veterinary information first before moving to a behaviour modification program, just to make sure they're not missing something in their training if there's an underlying issue there. And I have seen many dogs like that where I've spotted things that perhaps the owner hasn't, and that explains perhaps the aggressive outbursts in their dogs. So I think really the number one rule for me, though, if you're working with a rescue dog, is don't fixate on the obedience quite so much at the beginning. It's all about that relationship, okay, and getting that relationship right at the beginning and spending quality time, particularly in those first few months, building the right sort of relationship. That's a relationship where they can't always do whatever they want when they want. I think it's very important to note that we can't suddenly give these dogs all the freedom because perhaps they've had a difficult life. They still need structure and boundaries and rules. But I think building the right relationship is all about interaction. If you genuinely want to get the best out of these dogs, then you have to build a system of daily interaction, perhaps built in with a little bit of education in there at the same time, perhaps some training in there at the same time. But by far the best way to do this is through play and training games. And that could involve things that they enjoy. That's really what I start with when I'm working with these rescue dogs, is work out what they like. What's going to be innate to them, what's going to be natural to them. A spaniel is going to be interested in snuffling around and searching and hunting and snuffling and tracking things. A sight hound is going to be interested in fast moving objects that they visually see. We need to work with something that the dogs themselves really enjoy, and if you can connect with them over that, then you will find that your relationship will really blossom quite quickly and you'll get a really solid foundation. I do a lot of scent work with a lot of the rescue dogs, and that's because it's innate to them to be sniffing stuff, and I like it because it's calming exercise and we can work together as a team on it. So nose work and tracking for me are some of my favorites for doing with rescue dogs. The key is to incorporate this into your daily routine. If it becomes a daily routine, then you will get in the habit where your dog wants to do stuff with you rather than without you. We don't want to build too much independence in them. Otherwise, we start to find that they start to switch off and not work with us and start to make some potentially poor choices themselves. And ultimately, if you are struggling, I think the most important thing is get help. Never be afraid to ask for help from, a trainer who's got a really good background in these types of dogs. Ask and see, what they know, what sort of dogs and cases they've worked with, and make sure that you are getting advice that fits with perhaps what your own beliefs are. There are many trainers out there, and what's a good fit for one may not be a good fit for another. And you need to find the trainer that works, with what your beliefs are too. But essentially, I think really out of everything, if you invest in your dog, you will get the best. And that's probably our motto: invest and get the best. And that's the key. It's great taking a rescue dog on, but you need to be ready to invest in them, because ultimately the most important thing is they've had a lack of investment in the past, a lot of these. And if you stick to that, you should be fine, and you should really enjoy the company of a rescue dog. They are fabulous. I love all the rescue dogs we have. I love learning from them. They've taught me so much, and they're all different. And I think that is where I get the enjoyment of working with rescue dogs for the last 20 years. So now's an opportunity for you guys if you have any questions. We've got another 15 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, now's your time to ask. If perhaps you have a rescue dog yourself, perhaps there's something you don't know how to handle it, what to do. If there's anything, perhaps you're getting into the industry and don't know quite how to get started in working with these types of dogs, then now's your time to ask. So if there's anything else there, just put it forward as well, or get in touch. If you haven't got any questions right now and you think of something afterwards, just flick us an email, allsortsdogtrainingnz@gmail.com, and we're here to help as much as we can. We will be doing other webinars as well further down the line, particularly on more of the aggression side of things. So if you are interested in learning more, then please do come and join us on those other webinars. But if no one's got any other questions for now, then I will wish you guys a great evening. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about what we do with rescue dogs here and how to set your rescue dog up for success. Have a great night, everybody. Take care. Bye.